Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. Today I wanted to carry on the series of my dissertation, and I thought I would kind of explain what my dissertation is about, but kind of put it into more like layman's terms. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into loads of jargon about the law or ethics or, bioethics, gene editing or anything like that. I just thought it might be quite interesting for me to explain what I did and put it into sort of like a light-hearted video, and hopefully you guys will find it interesting. So I'm gonna firstly explain why I chose that dissertation topic, then I'm gonna explain what gene editing is, and then the law, and then the ethics, and then kind of conclude at the end. So I chose my dissertation topic because I realised I didn't want to be a lawyer after doing 2 years of law, and in my third year I wanted to combine more of my passions, which are bioethics and sort of medicine areas, with my law degree. So that's kind of what I did. I also want to go on and do a graduate medicine degree, so for me doing this dissertation was a really good way for me to like channel into that direction. So gene editing. A summary of what gene editing is: effectively going into your human DNA, and the human DNA is like a sequence. So if you kind of picture a computer, going into that sequence, finding the bit that you want to change or delete, and then locking onto it, and then removing bits out, putting bits in, cutting it, basically like a copy and paste machine. That effectively is what gene editing is. Now, the reasons why scientists and doctors want to pursue this is there are a lot of diseases that are genetic or disabilities that are genetic, which through gene editing, you can locate the element of DNA or the gene that is responsible for causing that disease or disability and go in and then remove it. So therefore it would eradicate genetic disease or disability. So there is quite a strong reason for wanting to pursue this thing. There are two different types of gene editing. So you can have somatic gene editing and germline gene editing. So I did my dissertation on germline because it has a lot more ethical issues. But to briefly explain the two, somatic gene editing focuses on somatic cells. So somatic cells are all of your bodily cells that aren't responsible for reproducing. So like skin cells, hair cells, that type of thing. Whereas germline cells are your actual reproductive cells. For a man, it would be like your sperm cells. For a woman, it would be more of your ovaries, your eggs. And they're the things that directly create offspring, and therefore they're your genetic genes. So you can gene edit on both, on somatic and germline cells. However, if you edit on somatic cells, because they don't impact that person's reproductive cells, those changes won't carry on to the next generation. They won't be passed on to their children. But with germline cells, because they do impact reproductive cells, it means any change made to a person will impact all the future generations. And that's why germline editing is a bit more contentious, well, a lot more contentious, because it doesn't just impact one person who can consent to it, it impacts that whole bloodline. Therefore, those changes have a really big impact. So gene editing within itself is relatively quite new. It has kind of been around since like the 50s, 60s, where people were kind of discovering cloning and that type of thing. But it really has only picked up in probably the last 10 or 20 years. So they had the Human Genome Project, which came out in the early 2000s, which basically mapped all of the genes in a human body. So scientists could kind of figure out which genes were responsible for what. So then once that information was available, it kind of enabled scientists to progress more with gene editing because they knew what genes did what, and therefore which genes might be responsible for certain diseases. And because it's so new and there's limited information on this topic and there's not really been that much research, a lot of people do think and acknowledge that it's just too new to actually do on human beings, and that we shouldn't be doing it yet because we don't really know the consequences. However, and there's always a however with stories like this where someone bends the rules, a scientist in China, forgive me if I mispronounce this, but I never know how to pronounce this 100%, Jiankui, put his name here, he conducted an experiment where he got multiple couples who were struggling to conceive. He then used IVF gene edited their embryos, inserted them, and then in the end, one couple was sort of chosen with the gene editing, and those babies were then born. So actually right now there are 2 babies who are twins, 2 girls, who are in the world, in China presumably, who are the first gene edited babies. Now he performed this gene editing in an attempt to make these babies more HIV resistant. That was what he wanted to do. However, there's a lot of mixed evidence on what he did in his experiment that show that that might not have been the case, and that he didn't really know what he was doing, which has then sparked this whole debate. Since then, the World Health Organization has put a committee together that is going to investigate and do extensive research on the area of gene editing to really figure out whether, as a species, as a world population of scientists, whether we should really be doing gene editing, and if we should be doing gene editing, to what extent? Like, should we be doing the full hog and start editing people, or should we sort of like be quite careful with it? So now for the law. For my dissertation, I focused on the law in the United Kingdom purely because I had 10,000 words, which isn't a lot of space to talk about stuff. It sounds like a lot, but once you get going, there really isn't enough room to actually elaborate on multiple like legal jurisdictions. So within the UK, we have a piece of legislation called the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act that was made in 1990. Now that is the act that governs this area. However, interestingly, the Act doesn't actually explicitly mention anything to do with gene editing. That's purely because at that time, gene editing really just wasn't a thing. Scientists didn't have the knowledge or the facilities or the technology to really be pursuing gene editing on any serious manner. Bear in mind at that point, they hadn't mapped the human genome. They didn't know what half of the genes did. How can then you go and edit, right? So when that legislation was passed, it neglected gene editing a lot, and that legislation hasn't been updated since. They updated a lot of areas of that legislation in 2008 when they passed a lot of amendments to the legislation, but none of those amendments directly relate to gene editing. So what does the Act say? So the Act says that you can create an embryo and use it for research purposes, but unless it's a permitted embryo, you have to destroy it within 14 days. Now, that's because at 14 days, cell differentiation starts to occur. So for the first 14 days, picture it like you have like a big sack. I mean, it's obviously minuscule, but you have like a sack of cells. And they sort of just float around for the first 14 days. And after 14 days, those cells start to be made into something. Most of those cells will go to the placenta, which obviously doesn't directly create a human life. It just supports the womb and the human life being made. And then the other portion of the cells will actually form the fetus and the embryo. So the law says that you can experiment and research with embryos up until that point, because up until that point, the fetus hasn't necessarily been made, or the differentiation hasn't occurred to know what the fetus is within those cells, and because half those cells won't even make the fetus, they kind of deem it to be okay. But then after that point, once you see that okay, it's a fetus, then it would be wrong to extend the 14-day marker. The only embryos that are allowed to pass that 14-day marker are the permitted embryos. Now, you can only have a permitted embryo if it comes from permitted sperm and permitted eggs, and you can only have permitted eggs or sperm if they are sourced with consent, if they are not merged with any sort of animal genetic material, and if they haven't been edited. So if you were to edit, sperm or eggs to gene edit a potential baby, once they're put together to make an embryo, it wouldn't be a permitted embryo, and therefore you'd have to destroy it up until the 14-day marker. So basically the law at the moment says that if you do want to gene edit an embryo, you can only do that up to 14 days and then you have to destroy it. So that marker is good for early stage research because it allows scientists to create embryos, to see how that early stage process can work, and to sort of, experiment on the gene editing process and how to do it on early embryo life. But you need to destroy the embryo within 14 days. So it is a cap on that research. And at current, if that cap stays in place, it's going to be very difficult for scientists to develop the research further and to see how gene editing extends beyond that point and how it plays out. So, there's a lot of academic debate to say, should we extend that 14-day marker? Should we change the law? And in my dissertation, I argued that we should change the law. There should be a lot of regulation in place to control it so it doesn't get abused, but that sort of 14-day marker eventually will be very restrictive for the science, and it will very much limit the technology being used to help people to stop them suffering from these, degenerative genetic disease and disability. So that's what I argued, but let me know in the comments if you agree that there should be a law change or what you think about the law at the moment. So now for the ethics. Because this area involves, morals, and it involves creating new life forms and a potential law change, there is a lot of ethical concerns around it. And I want to just outline the top 3 ethical concerns that I mentioned in my dissertation, and let me know in the comments below whether you agree that they are concerns, whether you think they could be argued against or they could be mitigated. And yeah, I'd be very interested to know whether you guys think these should be concerns or not in sort of the use of gene editing. So the first one is consent. Now, consent can be broken into 2 parts. So the first part is that when we physically create that embryo who has then been gene edited has not consented to that process. And now the second element of consent is that when that embryo grows up as a human being and then reproduces, every single one of their children and their children's children and so on have not consented to the changes that were made through the gene editing process. So there's sort of the element of that individual person and then all the future generations that will come from it. Now that's the ethical concern, but there's also been a lot of academic debate surrounding that, with academics saying that actually they don't think that it would be much of an issue. For example, a lot of academics have been of the school of thought that we can have surrogate decision making, and that within a lot of the medical and healthcare sphere, surrogate decision making happens all the time, and therefore gene editing would be no different. Surrogate decision making is the idea that as a parent, when you have a child, you make decisions on the child's behalf for what's in their best interests. So for example, this idea plays out when parents get their children vaccinated, or if their child, say, breaks their leg and they need to have an operation or have a cast on, and the parents say it's okay to do that. Often the child has no say and cannot consent to those decisions, yet the parent does it because they believe it's in that child's best interests. So they argue that for gene editing, if we can eradicate disease and disability, that it's in the child's best interest to not have a crippling disease that would then kill them within a short time frame. It would be in their best interest to have a normal life. Therefore, gene editing is okay under that school of thought. Another idea is the idea of hypothetical consent, i.e. when that child grows up and can consent legally, i.e. they're an adult and they understand the pros and cons of a decision, that they would themselves consent to it. And these academics say that, well, if you were to have had a really bad disease or disability, you would have been in a lot of pain or suffering, or you wouldn't have lived to the age of 18 if you hadn't have had gene editing. You would then consent to that procedure so you can live longer, or you can live a healthier life. So with those ideas, a lot of academics say that the issue of consent isn't really an issue, because there are a lot of decisions that happen within healthcare and within, children and things like that, that don't involve consent at the moment, so why would this be any different? But do you agree? The second ethical issue is eugenics. So for those of you that might not know what eugenics is, it's a term that was used and gained its popularity through Nazi Germany during the First and Second World War, and it sort of relates to an idea of social cleansing, an idea that the weaker people in society, or the people perceived to not contribute or create this ideal, therefore must be removed or killed or sterilized, so they can't then create more humans than populate the gene pool with their bad genes. That's the idea of eugenics. So the idea of gene editing and eugenics is that a lot of people think that we can then use gene editing to remove the bad traits in society like disease or disability, and therefore we are removing those people from the gene pool for future generations, and it's like a social cleansing, that we are deleting people out but their sort of traits add to the diversity that we have now, and therefore that's a bad idea, because we'll eventually end up with a disease and disability free society, which then is an idea of where we have cleansed the society, we've cleansed the gene pool. So this is probably one of the most prominent arguments that is attached to gene editing, and it's one of the most recurrent issues that keeps coming back around whenever gene editing has been debated, that this is the main fear that people have. However, a lot of academics have argued against this idea and said that in fact, if you just use gene editing under a very tight set of regulations and said, okay, we can only delete genetic diseases, or we can only do certain disabilities or certain things, it won't end up eradicating disease and disability from the gene pool. It will just do the odd one here and there, but there are still a lot of disease and disabilities that happen that aren't genetic and that just happen, you know, throughout somebody's life, that will then contribute to the gene pool, so actually it won't create a social cleansing or delete out disease and disability forever. Also, an idea attached to eugenics of why it's so controversial and negative is that often it's very forced. So, you know, back in Nazi Germany, the Nazis would get people and sterilize them against their will. Even in America in the 1970s, mass sterilizations against people's wills happened very, very frequently. So it kind of plays into the idea that this eugenic idea of stopping people from procreating is forced upon them. However, with gene editing, it would be made available as sort of a healthcare treatment like IVF and surrogacy and abortion is in countries, so therefore it wouldn't be forced, it would be someone's own choice, and therefore it takes away that state forced idea that we want to have this certain type of population, you must have gene editing. So a lot of academics believe that with the right level of regulation and with the right laws, that gene editing wouldn't lead to eugenics, it wouldn't lead to a eugenic society and social cleansing of the gene pool, and in fact that it would just help eradicate disease and disability in certain elements to help people rather than cleanse the gene pool, and therefore that ethical issue can be mitigated. So the third and final ethical issue is societal inequalities. Now this is in two parts. So firstly is the idea that if we gene edit and we therefore eradicate genetic disease and disability, that parents will then only want children who are free of disease and disability, and therefore it will create a prejudice eventually towards disabled people in the world. And obviously there will be a lot of disabilities and diseases that are still occurring that aren't genetic, and therefore those people will be discriminated against because there is this new breed of people who would have had genetic diseases but now don't, and therefore they'll be better, and that's what people will want more, and they won't want disabled people. That's the idea. Now, there is a lot of weight behind that argument to say that if we can remove disability and disease on one level, it says that those left with that disability are the ones that need to be fixed, or because they can't be fixed, therefore they're less than. However, there is also a lot of counter arguments against that point. You know, Genetic Alliance UK did a study that showed the majority of people who are disabled or who have a genetic disease actually agree with gene editing, and that they think it wouldn't lead to sort of a divide or more discrimination against the disabled community. So I think that's quite interesting in itself, that a lot of people who are directly from that community who would be impacted by this argument against societal inequality actually are very pro gene editing. And also there are a lot of philosophical counter-arguments to this point that essentially say parents wanting a child that doesn't have a disease or disability does not directly correlate with them seeing a disabled person in the street and being discriminatory towards them. It's the idea that parents want the healthiest child that they can have, but that's not to say that if they did have a child that had a disability or a disease, that they wouldn't love it the same that they would love a child that doesn't. And that's shown in a lot of ways where parents have had multiple children, one might have a genetic disease or disability, but the rest don't, and they don't love that child any more or any less. Now, the second element of societal inequality ethical issues is how would people have access to this technology? Obviously it's going to be developed, it's going to be new, therefore it's probably going to be expensive. Will it be available on the NHS? Will it only be rich people that get it? Therefore, will it mean that only rich people get to have their children be gene edited, and therefore poor people are going to still have disease and genetic disability, and it's going to create sort of that gap in between different aspects of society in terms of wealth? Who will have access to it? And there are a lot of questions around that sort of topic because they just can't be answered at this point. The technology is so not developed enough to be able to have answers to those questions. A lot of scientists and researchers say in an ideal world they would love for this technology to be able to be on the NHS like IVF, abortion, surrogacy are, but it's unknown at this point whether financially that would be, you know, available or whether people would have to pay for it. But at the end of the day as well, in the UK, a lot of services like IVF aren't available on the NHS for certain people. So, you know, gene editing might also go down that route where you'll have to pay for it. And I think, you know, it's going to be very interesting in years to come to see how this technology is packaged and made available to people, because it very well could only be available for the rich, not be available on NHS, and then it could really create a big divide between, you know, the rich and the poor and who can have access to it. So I think that's very interesting, and I'm very intrigued to see what you think about that, and whether you think it would be good if it was on the NHS, whether you think it shouldn't or should be on the NHS, whether you think it will create a big divide within society if it is or if it isn't. So I hope you found this video interesting, and I hope it's provided quite a sort of short but interesting oversight to gene editing and the law and ethics surrounding it. You know, there's a lot of unanswered questions about this topic, and the World Health Organization right now is still investigating in with their committee around those issues, and they're going to publish a report in 2021 with their findings. So it's a very exciting time for anybody that's interested in this area to see how this technology will progress in the future. But I'm very interested, as I've said throughout this video, to see what you guys think about this area. So let me know in the comments. Do you think there should be a law change? Do you agree with any of the ethical issues I've mentioned? You know, what do you think? Do you think we should be using gene editing at all? Or do you think this is something that should be banned and that we shouldn't be messing with it? Or do you think this is a really good way to help remove disability and disease from the world and therefore alleviate some suffering? So let me know in the comments. I'll be very interested to read them. So that brings an end to this video. I hope you liked it. I hope you found it interesting. I will see you in the next video. I'll see you next week. Bye guys.